Ever imagine a country shifting gears from like a communist system to a market-driven economy
Yep.
and somehow, not imploding?
Right.
That's China's story. We're diving into how China escaped the poverty trap to, understand how a country seemingly set up for chaos became an economic powerhouse.
And what's fascinating is that they didn't do it by, like, copying the West's playbook. This
Right.
isn't a build good institutions and wait for prosperity kind of story.
Right. It's like they tossed out the rule book or at least scribbled some seriously creative edits in the margins.
Right.
So how did China, starting with what the book calls weak institutions, manage to not just grow but thrive?
They were masters of what the authors called directed improvisation. Instead of being limited by a need for, perfect institutions from day one, they strategically adapted and evolved alongside economic growth. Think of it as a high-stakes game of economic jazz riffing within a structure, but with clear goals in mind.
Okay, so less symphony orchestra, more a free-flowing jam session with a purpose. I'm intrigued, but weak institutions seems like a loaded term. Could you elaborate on what that actually means in China's context?
Absolutely. It's not about a complete lack of structure, but rather a willingness to work with what they had, even if it didn't fit, the Western model. They inherited a system shaped by a communist past, one with its own unique characteristics and challenges. Rather than viewing this as an insurmountable hurdle, they incorporated those elements into a new, evolving approach.
So they treated those limitations as opportunities for innovation. I'm starting to see why this story grabs people's attention. Did this directed improvisation lead to any concrete examples of, shall we say, unorthodox economic strategies?
Oh, absolutely. Take, for example, the concept of en masse, personalized investment promotion. Imagine a whole country where officials at every level are tasked with attracting investments using their personal connections.
Wait, every single official? That sounds less like a government agency and more like a nationwide networking event.
Precisely. We're not talking about, like, cold calls and brochures here.
Yeah.
This was about leveraging every connection imaginable: family, friends, former classmates, even that distant cousin who'd moved abroad. It was incredibly effective, especially in the early stages.
That's a far cry from the stereotypical image of like an impersonal bureaucracy. It sounds like they were strategically blurring the lines between personal networks and professional roles.
Exactly. And while it might sound chaotic, it was actually a carefully calculated strategy. It allowed them to tap into networks and resources that would have been otherwise inaccessible.
This completely changes how we typically think about economic development. It wasn't about waiting for the perfect institutional environment. It was about embracing adaptability and finding solutions within the existing framework.
And that's a crucial point. China's experience suggests that developing countries might be better off focusing on building their institutions in tandem with economic growth, rather than waiting for some ideal scenario that may never materialize.
It's a fascinating example of how context shapes strategy. But this idea of directed improvisation, it's intriguing, but did this approach, with all its flexibility and experimentation, ever result in any, unexpected outcomes?
You bet it did. One striking example is the phenomenon of fake FDI, or foreign direct investment.
Fake FDI. Now, that's something you don't hear every day. Tell me more.
Remember how China was laser-focused on attracting foreign investment? They implemented policies that gave, preferential treatment to foreign-invested enterprises, offering tax break subsidies, you name it.
Ah, I see where this is going. Local businesses saw an opportunity to, game the system.
Exactly. They found creative ways to make their companies appear foreign, even if the source of the capital was ultimately domestic.
Wow.
They'd set up shell companies overseas, channel money through foreign bank accounts. They even partnered with foreign nationals, sometimes just on paper, to create that illusion of foreign investment.
But that's the next level ingenuity.
Yeah.
They were playing the system to fuel their own economic engine.
It really highlights their pragmatic approach. They understood the ultimate goal of attracting investment and weren't afraid to, push boundaries to achieve it. This wasn't just about, rule following. It was about results.
It was a calculated risk that ultimately paid off.
In many ways, yes. This fake FDI injected capital into the economy, spurred growth in key sectors, and ultimately helped them build a more robust economic foundation. Of course, this strategy wasn't sustainable in the long run.
Right, because as China grew, their needs and priorities shifted.
Precisely. As they climbed the economic ladder, their approach to investment evolved. They transitioned from a strategy of simply attracting capital to a more discerning approach, focusing on higher quality investments. They began prioritizing industries that aligned with their long-term development goals, like technology and innovation, and were less willing to offer generous incentives to just anyone.
So they moved from a quantity over quality approach to one that was more targeted and strategic.
Exactly. And this evolution wasn't limited to their investment strategy. Remember niche creation. They didn't try to force a single development model across this vast and diverse country.
So instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, they embraced regional specialization.
Absolutely. They recognized that different regions had different strengths and encouraged them to capitalize on those strengths. For example, Shenzhen transformed itself into a tech hub, attracting companies like Huawei and Tencent. It became a hotbed of innovation and a driving force in China's technological advancement.
It's fascinating how they managed to harness regional diversity to fuel national growth. They weren't afraid to let certain areas take the lead in specific sectors, creating a kind of economic ecosystem. So they went from encouraging almost any kind of investment to, like, carefully curating the kind of economic activity they wanted to attract. That's a big shift.
It speaks to their long-term vision. They weren't just thinking about, like, the next quarter's growth figures, but about building a sustainable economic powerhouse for the decades to come.
Which brings us to another important takeaway from this deep dive. China's story isn't static. It's a process of constant adaptation and evolution. They were never afraid to, switch gears or adjust their approach as needed.
Exactly. Their development path has been marked by distinct phases, each with its own set of challenges, strategies, and outcomes. They've constantly been fine-tuning their approach, learning from both their successes and their setbacks.
It reminds me of that saying, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. They had a direction, but were always ready to adapt their tactics. This directed improvisation wasn't about chaos. It was about calculated risk-taking and a relentless focus on achieving their goals.
And that's a crucial distinction. They didn't shy away from making tough decisions, even if those decisions came with some controversy. Their approach to development challenged conventional wisdom and ultimately forced the world to rethink its assumptions about how countries rise to economic power.
It's a story that's full of surprises and unexpected turns. But if we bring it back to our listeners, what are the broader lessons here? What can we glean from China's experience, even if we're not, governing a nation?
The biggest takeaway is the power of challenging assumptions and embracing adaptability. China's success wasn't preordained. It was the result of a willingness to experiment, to learn from their mistakes, and to constantly adapt to changing circumstances.
It's like they took that old saying, necessity is the mother of invention, and applied it on a national scale.
Precisely. They had a clear vision of where they wanted to go, but they were willing to be flexible and innovative in figuring out how to get there.
So, as our listeners navigate their own challenges, remember the lessons of China's journey. Be bold, be adaptable, and don't be afraid to improvise a little along the way. It's about embracing uncertainty as an opportunity for creativity and innovation.
Well said. We've seen how China defied expectations, leveraging so-called weak institutions to fuel remarkable economic growth. We've explored how they embraced adaptability, experimentation, and even a bit of rule bending to achieve their goals.
And we've learned that there's no single blueprint for success. It's about understanding the context, being willing to challenge assumptions, and embracing that spirit of directed improvisation.
So, as you face your own unique set of challenges, remember the power of flexibility and a strategic approach to problem solving. Think about how you might apply these principles of adaptation and focused experimentation within your own spheres of influence.
It's a reminder that we all have the capacity to be agents of change, whether it's in our businesses, our communities, or even our own lives. Now, that's a thought-provoking note to end on.
Indeed. And who knows what remarkable opportunities might emerge when we embrace the spirit of directed improvisation.
That's a wrap on today's deep dive into China's extraordinary economic transformation. We hope this exploration has given you new insights into development, innovation, and the power of strategic adaptation. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those approaches flexible.